But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all of you for being here. It's a great turnout, there's about 30 of us. And I think that's a wonderful thing to be happening when we're all still in a sort of a bit of a post-COVID haze, which we're in. I'd especially like to welcome some new guests here tonight. Quite obviously our guest speaker, Robert Hadler, and his wife Karen. Brett Taylor, who's come along from the Military History and Heritage Network, I gather to spy on us. I'm not quite sure why. Absolutely. He may or may not be disappointed. I don't know.
Taking notes.
Sandra, nice to see you here again. I didn't welcome you last time, and that was my oversight. Terry Bacon's an occasional visitor, but lovely to see you again, Terry, wherever you are.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, that's right. And of course, our erstwhile, what does that mean? Our famous president from the RSL, Mike Black. And Mike, I know you haven't been able to come for a few occasions, but it's been great to see you.
It's always a pleasure being here and seeing so many recognisable faces around the place. So keep coming.
Spending their money in the RSL. Those formalities lead us to the important part of the evening, and while we're also keenly awaiting listening to Robert and his presentation. I was delighted when Robert wrote to me out of the blue a few months ago, introducing himself and advising of the impending launch of his new book, Mutineers, the story behind which I knew but little. After reading Robert's background and interest in Australian history, especially when I note that his two books are about naval history, I quickly followed up to seek his agreement to be our guest speaker tonight. Robert lives in Melbourne and is a former award-winning economics journalist who's worked in the Commonwealth Public Service as a political advisor, lobbyist for industry groups and in senior executive roles. Since 2015, has been a director on government, corporate and not-for-profit boards. I'm sure there's a lot more in there that I haven't picked up on. Hopefully you've read the flyer that we issued to advertise this event, and note that his presentation tonight is entitled Murder, Mutiny and Political Controversy. Promises to be a fascinating account of the right from two dark moments in the history of the RAN and the wider area on our Navy and the nation. Robert's kindly agreed to sign copies of his book after we finish here at the table. We will provide a chair, no expense to come for him to do so, if you so wish. So Robert, it's with much pleasure that I invite you to talk to us now. And I'm pleased to say Robert is quiet for sound.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I presume this is working, it's not too loud. Great to see so many of you here on, thanks, that's great, on a Monday winter night, shortly after lockdown. So thanks a lot for coming. And I'm not wearing a mask, but hopefully I'm far enough away from everyone to not cause any problems. Andrew, thanks very much for the invitation. On behalf of myself, my wife Karen, and my friend Brett Taylor from Military History and Heritage Victorian, we're very pleased to be here tonight to talk to you. What Andrew didn't say about my background is that my father served in the Royal Australian Navy in the Second World War. He was on HMAS Hobart at the conclusion of the war and was in Tokyo Bay when they signed the surrender. So my affiliation with the RAN goes back to my father, but he served in the metropolitan courts, and I found myself on tugs and dredges and ferries for all of my youth. So that's my maritime career. But I spent 20 years in Canberra and developed a love of politics, and when I retired I decided to write about naval history and politics, and my two books, Mutineers and Dark Secrets, basically cover the two most controversial events in Australian history, both for the RAN and also Australian politics, in the first 50 years after Federation. So that's why I was interested in them and what I'm going to try and talk to you about tonight. So the books that I have, this is the one I've just finished writing, Mutineers. It's the second book published, but logically it goes first out of the two. Deals with a mutiny after World War I. And the second book, which I wrote first, Dark Secrets, deals with a murder on the cruiser HMAS Australia in the Coral Sea in March 1942 and what that meant for Australian politics. So the underlying theme in both books, and most people don't know this, is that the Royal Australian Navy was delegated to the operational control of the Admiralty in both the First World War and the Second World War. That meant that our ships and our naval personnel could be sent anywhere in the world without consultation with the Australian government. And the unintended consequence of that operational control of the Admiralty was that our sailors operated under the King's regulations, not Australian law, for the duration of their service in World War I and World War II. And that was a trigger for both the political controversy that occurred both at the end of World War I and World War II. So I'll get into the story. It'll take about half an hour, and then I'm more than happy to take any questions after that. So the story starts with 5 young working class lads out of Sydney and Melbourne who all joined the Royal Australian Navy just after the Navy was formed in 1911. The Australian Naval Forces, the fleet, first arrived in Sydney in 1913, and these guys flocked on the basis of that fleet arriving to join the fledgling rank. The two on your left-hand side are the main characters in the story, and the other 3 are the culprits who joined in the escapade. But Del Morton, rather the very handsome man on your left, and his brother Lenny, the second on the left, were born in Campsie in Western Sydney. They had no connection with the sea other than they wanted to run away from Western Sydney and see the adventure in the world on the high seas. Bill McIntosh was a baker from North Melbourne down here. Peter Thompson grew up in Richmond, the suburb where I live, and Ken Patterson grew up in Young but moved to Sydney and knew that and grew up with the Rudd brothers in Western Sydney. They were all very brave. They were all young and full of courage, but they were very naive, and they had no idea what was in store for them in the First World War under British regulations and British discipline. They all came together on the first flagship of the Royal Australian Navy, the battle cruiser HMAS Australia, which until recently was still the largest ship that had ever served in the Royal Australian Navy, and the most powerful in terms of its armament. It was coal-powered. The 5 of them served largely as stokers in the engine and boiler rooms of HMAS Australia. They basically did 1 tonne of coal for 1 nautical mile. So, and when they were sailing around the world, that was a lot of coal to be loaded onto the ship, a lot of coal to be shoveled, and a lot of cleaning to be done. They didn't envisage that this would be their lot on board HMAS Australia. And after the war broke out, they spent 6 months chasing the German fleet around the Pacific, but to no avail. The German fleet was eventually sunk by the British off the Falklands. And then the Admiralty decided, well, you can go to the North Sea. And they spent the rest of World War I at Scapa Flow, just north of Scotland. Basically on convoy duty, mine laying operations. It was boring as all hell. They all got sick because they'd never been in such bad weather. There was a measles outbreak. Australia only fired its guns twice in anger during the war. Once at a German supply ship in the South Atlantic, and once at a suspected German submarine in 1917. And that was it. It collided with two Royal Navy cruisers during the war, and as a result of those collisions and the damage which got repaired, they missed all the big battles in World War I. So morale was at rock bottom. It was seen as an unlucky and an unhappy ship. And these guys increasingly resorted to drink and trouble, which is the standard fare of naval personnel who aren't very happy on board ships. And rising discontent. When the war ended, all the five and their fellow conspirators, all they wanted to do was to get home and get off the boat. But they didn't leave England until April 1919, and they didn't get back to Australia until late May 1919. And on the way, there were signs of increasing trouble. There was discontent in Port Said when Dalmorton Rudd got caught by the Shore Patrol drunk and fighting with the Shore Patrol. He was demoted. That destroyed his morale. And then the crossing of the line ceremony between Ceylon, as it was then called, and Australia. This group of sailors here, mainly stokers, decided to be somewhat overly rough with the chief engineer and some of the other officers in the dunking ceremony that accompanied the crossing of the line. This was signs that there was trouble brewing. Neither the captain or the squadron commander were too worried about it. They should have been. Because when they got to Fremantle in 1919, the first 3 days were spent on official duties, parades, morning teas at the Governor-General's, marching through Perth. On the Saturday night before they left Fremantle to sail to Adelaide, Melbourne and then Sydney, the captain gave them shore leave. Big mistake. Because when they got to shore, the sailors headed straight for the pubs at Fremantle. The captain didn't know it, no one else knew, but the pubs were full of union men who'd gone on strike and been involved in what's called the Battle of the Barricades earlier in the year. Violent demonstrations in which against scab labour on the wharves in Fremantle, where one of their members was killed by the police. And the very day that Australia pulled into Fremantle, they had the coronial inquiry in Fremantle into the death of this union member. So the pubs were full of all these disgruntled unions, labourers on the wharves, and all these guys letting off steam after 3 months at sea coming back from the war. One of them described that there was an air of Bolshevism in the pubs. Now these guys, going back to the boat Sunday morning, still drunk, many with hangovers, decided they didn't want to leave port. They wanted to stay and sleep off their hangovers. The official line was that they were going to thank the people of Fremantle for their hospitality. So I got back on board. They got 80 to 100 in the crew. There were 800 in the crew, so it was about roughly 8% of the crew on the quarterdeck, demanding that the captain see them so they can make their request that they would stay in Fremantle for another day. Funnily enough, the captain declined their invitation to stay in Fremantle for another day and ordered them to sail. However, the 5 guys that I showed at the start decided that they had plan B, And plan B was to get the stokers out of the stokehold so that the engines couldn't be fired up and they couldn't sail. Once again, the captain outsmarted them. He got the petty officers and some of the junior crew to go down and fire up the boilers and get the engines going, and they sailed. And when they were out of sight, he got them all on deck, read them the King's regulations, and only then did they realise that they committed mutiny and they were in deep trouble. The captain, I think, would have let them sleep off their hangovers. However, the squadron commander, who was in charge of the whole of the fleet, was also on board the flagship, John Dummeresque. And John Dummeresque was shattered by what he saw as the blow to the reputation of the Royal Australian Navy by this mutiny. So he ordered an investigation and he wanted the ringleaders court-martialed. The 5 ringleaders were quickly identified and they were put in the ship's cells while the ship sailed around to Sydney. When they got back to Sydney, Commodore Glossop, who was the senior naval officer in Sydney, formed the president of the court-martial, and Dick Orchard, who was a nationalist and member of Parliament, became the prisoner's friend or the defence attorney during the court-martial. Del Morton's rugged father, who lived in Sydney still at that time, came to see the boys in the Garden Island detention barracks. He encouraged them to plead guilty, get it over and done with, seek the clemency of the court, rather than fight it. Orchard agreed. They had the court-martial last of less than the morning, and the 5 mutineers were sentenced to hard labour in Goulburn Jail for several years each, and dismissal from the Navy. This was 6 months after the war, and there was no appetite in the Australian community for harsh prisons, what they saw as harsh prison sentences, for effectively what was seen as a schoolboy prank trying to go on strike in Fremantle without any violence. So the New South Wales Labor Party and the Federal Labor Party immediately seized on these sentences to embarrass the federal government, the nationalist government, after the war. The Prime Minister Billy Hughes and the Navy Minister Joseph Cook were still in Paris, negotiating the Paris Peace Accord, and Bill Watt was acting Prime Minister, and Alec Poynton from South Australia was acting Navy Minister. Quite frankly, they didn't handle it well, the attack from the Labor Party. They focused only on naval discipline and didn't understand the political imperative of the community, which was to be lenient to these guys, and after the war, and call it quits. There was a federal election due at the end of the year, and this just got worse and worse and worse the longer it lasted over the months from June to August 1919. Billy Hughes and Joseph Cook eventually came back. They read the Riot Act to the government and to the Navy. They intervened politically. They went direct to the Admiralty in London, and they said, we want to get these guys out of jail quickly. Can you help us? The Admiralty basically came back and said the 2 youngest guys, Peter Thompson and Ken Patterson, who were basically led astray, could be let out by Christmas, but the other 3 who were the chief culprits, the Rudd brothers and Bill McIntosh, had to stay in jail for at least a year. That was never going to fly politically because it wasn't going to kill off the issue before the federal election. So Billy Hughes went over the head of Admiralty and went straight to their political masters, the Colonial Secretary at Whitehall. Alfred Milner, the Colonial Secretary, saw the political smarts of not having a fight with Australia just after World War I, and made a political accommodation with Billy Hughes, and it was agreed that the 5 sailors would be let out of prison in December 1919, only 6 months in jail. This solved the political problem, killed it off as an election issue, but unbeknownst to everyone else, the 2 senior naval commanders in Australia, who were professional Royal Navy officers, were furious that the government had gone over the head of the Admiralty and had undermined naval discipline and the chain of command. So the squadron commander, John Dummerest, and the chief of the Australian Naval Staff, Rear Admiral Percy Grant, threatened to resign. This would have been unprecedented in the short history of the land, would have created a diplomatic incident. So Sir Joseph Cook worked behind the scenes with Percy Grant to work up a compromise. And the compromise was that the government would issue a fleet order that basically said that the government had decided to let these guys out of jail early. It shouldn't be seen as any undermining of naval discipline and the chain of command. So they withdrew their threats to resign, and the issue was resolved, politically and for the Navy. Unfortunately, the compromise meant they never faced into the underlying issue of Royal Navy control of the Royal Australian Navy during the war and what that meant for Royal Navy discipline applying to Australian Navy personnel. Because those guys were found guilty under the King's regulations and Royal Navy regulations, not under Australian regulations. This would come home to roost in the Second World War. That takes me on to the next part of the story, which is 3 guys, and unfortunately I couldn't find a photo of a young Ted Elias, but there were 3 guys who came together on the second HMAS Australia, HMAS Australia II, the flagship of the Royal Australian Navy in World War II. It was a heavy cruiser, town-class cruiser. The first one was Ron Gordon. He came out with his parents from Portsmouth to Australia in 1927 under the Empire Scheme. He and his brother Frank joined the Navy in 1930. And unfortunately for Ron, both of his parents died, this is relevant for today, of the influenza in 1933. And he was put into boarding school in South Melbourne. His older brother was already in the Navy, so he had no one to look after him. But as soon as he could get out of the boarding school at the age of 16, he joined the RAF. The second one was Ted Elias. Ted was the only son of his parents, Christina and Alfred. Unfortunately, Alfred died when Ted was only 2.5, and Ted grew up with his mother as a housemaid in Woolloomooloo, and that's a photo of Woolloomooloo in Sydney where they grew up. Jack Riley was 16.5 when he joined the Navy in 1939. He was only a teenager, grew up in Bellerive in Hobart. He'd gone aboard Hobart and Australia with the Hobart Regatta in 1938. Couldn't resist joining the Navy. Once again, these 3, fate brought them all together in the engine room of HMAS Australia. Once again, Australia was under Admiralty control in the Second World War. Without telling the Australian government, Australia fought against the Vichy French in Dakar in West Africa, Operation Menace in 1940. It was under the German bombs and the Blitz in London in 1941, and it was in 1942 that it sailed back as the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor into Sydney. It was quickly turned around and sailed with Task Force 44 into the Coral Sea to stop the Japanese invasion of New Guinea. And these are two photos of the task force in the Coral Sea and crewmen on the Australia just before the battle. Unlike Australia I, Australia II was generally a lucky and happy ship. It escaped direct bombardments and torpedo attacks on many occasions until late in the war when kamikaze aircraft dive bombed it. And it was generally a happy ship. However, there was a dark secret on HMAS Australia, and that there was a group of homosexual sailors on the ship. Both Ron Gordon and Ted Elias were rumoured to be part of that homosexual group, and it was rumoured that Jack Riley was trying to blackmail about that. So on the 13th of March, Friday the 13th of March, unfortunately there was a fight in the darkness of the night on the deck of the cruiser. No one could actually see what was happening apart from three men in the gloom fighting on the deck of the cruiser. Unfortunately, Jack Riley was the victim of that attack, suffered 14 stab wounds, many to the abdomen and into his vital organs. That's the sick bay where he was treated. Malcolm Stenning, the surgeon, tried to save his life, stitched up all the wounds. On his deathbed, Jack Riley claimed that Ron Gordon had stabbed him. But unfortunately, peritonitis, blood poisoning from the stab wounds, killed him. There was no formal statement taken, and that deathbed accusation couldn't be used in any court of law. Jack Riley was buried at sea the next day. This was the first time in my book this photo had been provided and shown publicly from the family. The Anglican Reverend Frank Oliver sent this to the Riley family in WWII, amongst some letters from Jack to the grieving family. So the pain of what happened still lives today in WWII. Once again, there was a court-martial. The captain of Australia, Harold Falcon, as was the case in naval tradition, acted as prosecutor. Paymaster Lieutenant Trevor Ratke, a former civilian lawyer, was dragged out of Darwin shortly after Darwin was bombed to be the defence attorney, the prisoner's friend. Once again, it didn't take long for the court-martial to convict Ron Gordon and Ted Elias of the murder of Jack Riley. However, there were no eyewitness accounts. There was no murder weapon. There was no motive. Because the Navy didn't want to drag up the fact that they were dealing with the blackmail murder of two suspected homosexual men. They didn't want to destroy RAND morale. They didn't want to provide the Japanese with a lot of propaganda to use against the Australians. So they had to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. But I've got to say, Farncombe did a fantastic job of presenting that circumstantial evidence to the court-martial. The two men were found guilty, and they were under British regulations, not Australian law. Under British regulations, they were sentenced to death by hanging at the yardarm. The new Australian government was the Labor government under John Curtin. It had only been in government for 6 months. They were stunned when they heard about the death sentence. They were opposed to capital punishment. The Navy Minister, Noumea, told the Navy not to carry out the sentence until the government could work out what they wanted to do. At that stage, they didn't know they had no power to overturn the sentences. Two legal advisors volunteered their efforts to have a habeas corpus case in the High Court. This was an historic case in the High Court, just before the Battle of the Coral Sea. They argued that they should have been tried under Australian law, British law, but the full bench of the High Court all ruled that the sentences were valid because the Australian government had handed operational control of the Navy to the Royal Navy and the Admiralty for the duration of the war, and they breached the King's regulations and were subject to those sentences. Once again, the Australian government was in apoplexy. It was between a rock and a hard place. It had to go to the British government to seek help. So they eventually went to Clement Attlee, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs, to ask for clemency. What help can you provide us to stay the death sentences? And Clement Attlee was initially very reluctant to help. The Royal Navy at that stage was full of Dominion staff. They didn't want to create a precedent for two Australian naval ratings that could undermine the code of discipline right across the world. So they refused to help. They said, you have to find another way. So John Curtin and Bert Evatt, they didn't know it, but they had an ally in Viscount Cranbourne, who was Secretary of State for the Colonies and was very close to the King. And he'd been warning Churchill and the King for some time that unless they accommodated the Dominion concerns about war strategy, and in this case discipline of how the naval ratings were treated, Australia could pull out of the war effort. So he convinced the King, on approach from Bert Evatt, to provide royal clemency. And the King agreed within 6 days of the request being provided. So this was unprecedented. He commuted the death sentences to life in prison. And you think this was fantastic. They weren't going to be killed, but what it meant for Ron Gordon and Teddy Weiss, of course, was that they were going to spend the rest of their life in Goulburn Jail. Not 6 months like the Mutineers, but the whole of their life. And activists, human rights activists in Australia, weren't content with that. And neither was Bert Evatt. Bert Evatt decided, and this has been a long-standing Labor Party policy for decades, that they wanted to adopt the Statute of Westminster. The British government had adopted the statute in 1931, which gave all the Dominions the power, independent status as members of the Commonwealth. Australia and New Zealand refused to adopt the statute, and that meant that British law overruled Australian law until the Statute of Westminster was adopted by Australian Parliament in 1942. Now, there was a lot of grandstanding, but Bert Evatt used the murder on the Australia as the excuse to adopt the Statute of Westminster. And he pushed it through Parliament in October 1942. And it wasn't until that occurred that Australia was technically and legally independent of Great Britain. The activists, that solved the problem from the government's point of view, but it didn't solve the problem for Ron Gordon and Teddy Weiss. They were still in prison, still subject to the sentences, but the activists, the family, the lawyers weren't giving up. They put so much pressure on Bert Evatt that in 1944, 2 years later, he agreed to an independent judicial inquiry by Justice Alan Maxwell from the New South Wales Supreme Court. That's him on your right. That's his son also, Alan Maxwell, which is a bit confusing. 1 L for the junior, 2 L's for the senior. You need to find out how to differentiate them. And Percy Spender also was a key witness for the defence at the Maxwell inquiry. Maxwell ended up saying that he believed the 2 men were guilty, It took 5 days. He went and visited Australia in harbour, both at day and at night. Interviewed and interrogated everyone involved. He said, on the balance of all legal probabilities, not a military court-martial, they were guilty. But he said there were defects in the court-martial. The primary defect was that Harold Farncombe, the captain, had expressed his personal opinion that the men were guilty. And this could have influenced the other panel members of the court-martial who were less junior officers or more junior officers to Farncombe. So on the basis of that technical defect, he said they should be, they shouldn't have suffered the death penalty, they shouldn't suffer life imprisonment, and the sentences should have been reduced. He didn't say how long they should be reduced by. That led to another 6 years of argument, legal argument, between the Navy and the Attorney General's Department about how long it should be. But eventually it was agreed that they could be released under a peace war and good behaviour. And Ron Gordon, who's on your left, and Ted Elias, who subsequently became known as Ted Ellis, both got married, lived very happy lives. Now it raises the question, if they were truly homosexual, would they have been getting married after the war, 1 week after they were let out of jail? There's a big debate about that. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. That ends the story. Didn't solve the agony for the Riley family in Hobart, in Belrive. But once again, the unintended consequences of the Admiralty having control of the Australian Navy caused both of these incidents to be major diplomatic controversies in both the First World War and the Second World War. Thanks very much for your time. Happy to answer any questions. Sorry, what's that?
I said they both do get life.
I got life here. Sorry, he said they both got life. Well, they got happily married.
It's interesting counterpoint the Naval Royal Navy having the power, because in the First World War, the Australian RAF in France was the only combatant nation where it was the Australian law, a military law, was that there could be no death penalty. And the English were always really upset when the Australians had run off from the deserters in court, and they just laughed and say, you can't shoot me. Whereas New Zealand, some were executed, Canadians, Americans, English, Germans, were the only thing. So it's interesting that in the Navy, the Australians went under the Royal Navy, but in the Army, even in the middle of France, the Australian law prevented any of those things happening.
Yeah, look, I'm repeating the question because I've been asked to do so for the tape. But the question and the comment was basically why the Royal Australian Navy was under the control of the Admiralty and subject to the King's regulations, whereas the Army wasn't. They operated under Australian military law. I think it goes back to the fact that the Royal Australian Navy didn't have any officers when it was formed that were capable. They weren't commissioned Australian officers. The only Australian officers that were available had been trained in England, and they were part of the Royal Navy. So they'd been inculcated in the law and the culture of the Royal Navy. And the vast majority of officers on Australian naval craft in World War I were Royal Navy officers. We wouldn't have had a Navy if it hadn't been for the Royal Navy. And because of that, and the other thing I think is the size of the Australian Navy. It was basically it was less than 10 ships. And technically the German East Asian squadron was bigger. in terms of the numbers of ships, although the Australia was the more potent country. So it was always envisaged that the Australian Navy would operate as part of the British Navy in the Far East. So when the war erupted, it was a quick decision by the government, with the Governor General to sign the order of the Australian Navy being part of the Royal Navy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Whereas for the Army,
Yeah.
we've been serving, we had military land forces, experienced Australian officers, and we had more than enough men under arms.
We had the greatest general in the First World War, didn't we?
We did punish.
On it.
And his chief of staff, General Blamey, as he became, in the Second World War, also learned a lot from Monash. Brett's writing a book about Blamey at the moment.
Robert, could I ask you one? I've got to say it was really great. Thank you, and I appreciate the reading your books. How much you introduced the personal aspects of these players. So you didn't touch on too much tonight because it was about the bigger picture. But what I'm intrigued about was Dalmorton Rudd earned, before they came back to Australia and were in Fremantle, he was part of a raid on Zimbabwe, was that right? And was awarded a DSM. To what extent do you think that might have influenced any leniency towards them when they considered that he was a hero in many respects?
So Andrew has just asked about Dalmorton Rudd was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal when he volunteered for a raid on the German submarine base at Zeebrugge, I think it is, but my pronunciation may be incorrect, sorry if it is, in April 1918. Was that taken into account? A bit of background about it first. 11 sailors from Australia were allowed to volunteer. I think, whether it was actually volunteering or they wanted to go, we're not quite sure. But they were the biggest, the tallest, the strongest men from the Australia were selected to go. They were all rapt to go. They'd been up in Scapa Flow, laying lines on convoy duty, on senseless stunts against a non-existent German Navy. They were bored, I won't say what I was going to say, they were bored out of their minds, and they were desperate to go and fight the Germans. This force of the Royal Navy, there were 250 Royal Navy ships, something like 3,000 Royal Marines, and the 11 Australians. The 11 Australians were right in the thick of the action. They had to scale a sea wall, and they fought hand to hand. Dalmorton Rudd and another sailor, Henry Gillard, fought hand to hand with German defenders on the mole, on the sea wall. And 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the battle. Dalmorton Rudd was included in a ballot for the Victoria Cross, but the numbers in the ballot weighed heavily for the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines, and all the VCs went that way. But he was awarded, along with Gillard, the Distinguished Service Medal. This gave him great bragging rights on the ship, and that was more important to him than anything else. So when he was demoted after the drunk in charge in Port Said, that was a major blow to his morale and a contributing factor to his behaviour in Fremantle. To answer your question now, it was taken into account in the court-martial proceedings, but because he was seen as the chief ringleader, he didn't get much traction with the court-martial panel. But the media lapped it up, and it contributed to a lot of the political pressure from the Labor Party to free the hero of Zeebrugge.
Robert, that's quite fascinating. But I understand that, in fact, were they really going to be hung by the yardarm, do you think? If they, before they were actually appealed and sent back. Because I understand that the Royal Navy, the last person that was hung by the yardarm was the Royal Marine, I think the one of the wars in with
About
China.
1815 or something like that.
Yeah,
That's right.
something.
No, there hadn't been-
1845 or
Something.
44 or something.
Sorry, sorry, I can't remember your name.
Jan.
Jan asked whether they would have been hung under the Royal Navy regulations or not.
I know they were practising it apparently with bags of flowers.
They were practising it. And the sailors who have written the diary entries which were in the War Memorial were convinced that Farncombe wanted to hang them. But the interesting thing is, once Farncombe had actually carried out his duties as prosecutor, he then actively lobbied the squadron commander, Jack Crace, and the Australian Commonwealth Naval Board in Melbourne to intervene and stop the hangings. Because Crace was born in Gungahlin in Canberra, and Farncombe was an Australian naval officer. Neither of them wanted these men to hang under British regulations. But they had to go through the motions because they were under British regulations at the time. Even though they were serving with part of the US fleet in the Coral Sea, the order from 1939 still held and they couldn't override it. I don't think they would have hung them. I think Crace knew that in going to the Commonwealth Naval Board in Melbourne, he knew that they would have to go to the politicians to get approval. And he knew the Labor government would intervene. But it wasn't as clear cut as they all thought. So it took months to find a way out.
I was just going to ask a question. As far as I recall, we served under the Articles of War up until early 60s when they changed over to regulations for the RAN. And quite clearly, there's an item there, punishment of hanging by the neck. It's not in the Articles of War.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate further on that? Would that have been, it's there, but I don't know if it ever been exercised.
No, I was asked about the death penalty in the Articles of War, which is part of the King's regulations, which applied up until 1960s.
We studied Queen's regulations.
Queen's regulations in the 1960s. Why that was the case and whether it was ever used. It was never used.
Right.
And following the Statute of Westminster in 1942, if that incident had ever occurred again, the Australian government could have intervened. So the regulations were effectively redundant, although they still applied for treason.
Right.
So it's a moot point because treason, to our knowledge, has never occurred in the Navy. But if it had, the death penalty may apply.
One thing I noticed, I had the dubious excitement of being a civvy, but working very closely with the Navy, the Army and the Air Force, and each one of them I did long courses, Cerberus and Point Cook and the Army up Puckapain, and I had to sit in classrooms. And the contrast between the Navy and in the middle was the Army and the Air Force. So in the Air Force, it was like my high school days in the country. You all sat back, people laughing and carrying on. And the instructors up there, they had their uniforms on. I was a civvy. And then you go to the Army, and it was all a bit more formal. But when you went down to service, I tell you, I was the only civvy in the classroom. Even I had to sit bolt upright with this chief pedal because I walked in and all the fellows would be rigid. So even now, I could tell between the three services was very steep in the old tradition of the Navy. So I can see why it would still be like that.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Jared.
Jared was talking about the cultural differences and the different standard of discipline between the Air Force, the Army and the Navy. And I think it goes back why the Navy has always been more rigid in discipline. There's two things. I think one is the code of the King's regulations and the Royal Navy practice, which had applied for centuries, was applied to the Royal Australian Navy from its outset. And Royal Naval officers ran the Royal Australian Navy basically until Collins was appointed squadron commander in World War II. So, and chief of staff of the Navy. And that's when it started to change a little bit. But it had been right, the Royal Navy culture had been inculcated right throughout the Royal Australian Navy for 40 years by that time, if not longer. Whereas in the Army and the Air Force had shorter histories, and they had histories which are much more dominated by volunteer militia forces. And a lot of the officers had come up through the ranks, whereas that didn't apply to the Navy. Particularly the Royal Navy, it was almost impossible to come up through the ranks. And the vast majority of Royal Navy officers came from the upper and middle classes. So that's another contributing factor for the class differences that apply in both the First and Second World Wars, particularly the First World War, between the officer class and the lower decks.
And on that note, when you're a kid from the bush and you've been in the mines and you come and you get a job in the dockyard and live there, and then they check you and give you a ticket for top secret and say you can go anywhere in the ship, because the Stilly boys did that to me. And I'm going through this bush, bumping my head, and it's got pipes. I'm thinking, no way, I'm going to be a sailor. So anybody who's a sailor, I respect it. And then I open the door, and I look in and I think, what the? And there's a picture on the wall of a beautiful little scene out in the bush. And there's a little chair with, like out of my grandmother's house, and a little bunk and a little desk with a wooden desk. And I think, what the? And I said to my neighbour, that's Captain's room. It was so different.
Sure it wasn't mine.
And that was the thing when they told me about it, the captain was separate from the officers and the men.
Yeah, look, the squadron commander on the Australia I had a butler and a security guard outside the Admiral's quarters at the rear of the ship, the stern of the ship. And one of the sailors who wrote his memoirs after the war, Lofty, that great name, because he was obviously tall. He was originally a Kiwi, so like Brady had a bit of mischief in him. He was on the guard duty one night, and he also managed to drop a derrick through the roof of the Admiral's quarters. So he described at great length the Admiral's quarters and what they looked like, which weren't far different to what you were talking about.
Should get Andy to talk about his cabin.
Wondering that strict regime of the RAN, whether that carried through to all the Commonwealth navies where the King was head. The US probably had their forms of discipline. The Japanese officers were trained by the Royal Navy in World War II, whether that carried through into their thing.
Yeah, look, I think the same historical cultural traditions apply in the Dominion navies, and it was very much so for Canada and India, South Africa. The Statute of Westminster was actually driven by South Africa and Canada, and they wanted independence after World War I as independent dominions of the rather than as colonies of the Empire. And they didn't have big navies. Australia probably had the biggest navy of any of the dominions. So therefore, the influence of the Royal Navy was much bigger in Australia than it was in any of the other dominions. And it took Australia until 1942 to adopt the Statute of Westminster. New Zealand didn't adopt it until 1947, until after the war. Sorry, you had a question.
Disentangle my hearing aid. Just having served for 30 years in the Royal Canadian Navy, I can make a few comments about that. Firstly, Canada adopted the Statute of Westminster right away. The Canadian Navy was very small, tiny in World War I. It was tiny in 1939, but it was something like 100,000 people at the end of the war. It was governed by the regulations for the Royal Canadian Navy, Canadian regulations. As far as I know, there were no senior Royal Navy officers in the RCN during the war. There were a lot of retired RN officers who served in the Navy, because the Admiralty said that if you're a retired RN, you're living in Canada, you can be called up, and they were, but then they were RCN, so it was quite different.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I couldn't remember when Canada adopted the Statute of Westminster, and therefore Canadian law would apply. But the same thing happened in South Africa. So both Canada and South Africa and Newfoundland, which was separate in those days, adopted the statute very quickly in 1931, but it took Australia and New Zealand a lot longer. It's interesting to note that HMAS Sydney and Melbourne guarded the east coast of Canada in the First World War because the Canadian Navy was too small. And HMAS Melbourne and HMAS Sydney, sorry, I think it was Sydney, early in the Second World War, also worked up from the West Indies, went up to Canada to protect the east coast.
Can I just make another comment about that? In 1939, 1940, when an Australian cruiser, I can't remember which one it was at the moment, was in the Caribbean, there were two Canadian destroyers that operated with the Australian cruiser, basically watching German ships that were in neutral ports. And in fact, this Australian cruiser, can someone tell me which one it was?
I think it was Hobart.
Hobart, was it? Yeah. Went through the canal to refuel two Canadian destroyers that were coming from Fremantle round to the east coast. And they had to do this because the United States was neutral, and if they refueled ships, their ships would have to go back to Canada. So they were refueled by an Australian ship, came through the canal, went on to Halifax.
And just one observation, life was a little bit better for the stokers on HMAS Australia II, because in the Second World War the flagship was ran on fuel oil, not on coal. So there were more technicians in the Second World War than the coal shovelers in the First World War. So,
Robert, it's just, and everybody, it's just a comment about the Statute of Westminster, which was originally, what should I say, drawn up in 1931. I think if there had not been a change of government at the time, because you had the Scullion government in power, and with the Depression, but we're also going back to World War I, you've got the conscription referendum, so there is a very anti-imperialistic view, and it has been from the turn of the century, which was why Australia wanted independence. But of course, through the 20s, you get a Conservative government. What was his name? Who wore spats and had been to Oxford,
Stanley Bruce Bentley.
Stanley
Bruce.
Page.
Oh, Earl Page.
Yeah.
But Stanley Bruce for
Stanley Bruce.
Christmas
And
Bruce.
Stanley Bruce and Earl Page. But then you get the Labor government coming in, the Scullion government. But don't forget they appointed the first Australian Governor-General, who was Isaac Isaacs. But then, of course, with the Lyons government and so on, we revert back to conservatism, which is why they didn't ratify the Statute of Westminster until they get a situation where this is a real problem.
I was asking about the background of the Statute of Westminster. It wasn't adopted earlier, and I think it was the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Under the Scullion Lyons government.
But it was also the political divide in Australia at the time.
There were bigger issues.
Brought on because of World War I, the end of World War I, and then the 20s.
Menzies, when he was Attorney General in the late 30s, put the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act on a bill into Parliament twice. but let the bill lapse both times.
Yeah.
The Conservatives simply didn't want to cut the open skies
No,
with
that's
Great
exactly
Britain
right.
in the lead up to the war.
Yes, and it was a big shock when, of course, then there's the confrontation in the Middle East and North Africa when Curtin wants the troops brought back and succeeded against Georgia. Well, it's a very interesting period if you look at it from
It's-
foreign
it's-
view.
Very much history.
The big thing that got them, of course, was the fall of Singapore, because that showed the nation from
Yes.
England down far out, and we started to look at over. My mother said they prayed for the Americans.
Well, it was a
After the fall
big,
of Singapore,
it was,
they did the Americans.
the fall of Singapore marked the long, slow decline of the British Empire in the Far East. And it marked the pivot in war strategy from Great Britain and the Empire to the United States. And Byrd Evett, who was Minister for External Affairs, as well as Attorney General, flew to the US on MacArthur's Catalina flying boat to meet Roosevelt to cement that relationship in April 1942. In fact, he flew over the Australia and the Coral Sea in that flying boat on the night that Jack Riley was murdered. So, and he didn't know at the time and had no idea that Riley's death was going to cause all these issues and provide the platform for the adoption of the statute.
You can come back one night and talk about the conscription between the first and second. You know that, don't you?
Sorry.
No,
Yes, I do know about it. That,
Yeah, that's
in
not
fact,
true.
there's an even better story about the security agency legislation that was passed by Hughes in the First World War. That might be the subject of the third one.
I'd be right to bring this up, but at home I have written by a Second World War veteran, I say a deposition or a story about a mutiny that was on West Australia. And when I researched it myself, I found out the high-ranking officers were blaming other people instead of blaming themselves, were taking responsibility. And there seems to be these stories that I've heard tonight, it's the same sort of thing. With the West Australia, that 3 men were charged and jailed for mutiny in the end, and it was all about food. It was all about starving on board a ship, and it was all about high-ranking officers sending off ships which weren't properly supplied and everything else. So people weren't taking those responsibilities. And the story I've got at home, written by a Second World War veteran who's dead, it really hits home. And I've never showed anyone this paperwork that I have because it's, I suppose, a bit controversial.
So, sorry, what do you
Chris Harvey,
Chris, thanks for
President of the AMC of the Side Association.
thank you for your comment and your question about the fact that there's a big debate in naval circles about who's responsible for mutinies and what drives mutinies. And I wish I had known about that manuscript when I was writing about the mutiny in World War I, because there were other mutinies in Australia.
Oh yes, there are mutinies.
The period in particular in World War II was a big mutiny. But there was also one on HMAS Phantom in the Gulf of Siam, as it was in those days, in 1916. So, in nearly every case, the mutinies were caused by lack of food, lack of pay, or promotion opportunities only provided to British sailors and Australian sailors. In the case of the Australia, it was also caused by lack of action against
British officers I found, not Australian officers. I bet Australian officers were very lenient and very understanding.
to some extent, but they also had to operate under the King's regulations. So there were cultural differences between the Royal Navy officers and the Australian officers. I think Australian officers, it's fair to say, were closer to the ranks than the Royal Navy officers who were in the class structure.
Yeah.
Um,
Like not giving someone Victoria Cross when they should have got one, you know, during the Second World War. And so, just until recently, we all know, received one.
Dumbarest was noted as a disciple of discipline. And he was rigid black and white discipline with the King's regulations. However,
That's good.
the captain, Claude Cumberledge, who was also a professional Royal Navy officer, was much more lenient with the sailors. He would have let them sleep off the hangovers if it hadn't been for Dumbarest being such a strict disciplinarian. So I don't think it's black and white Royal Navy versus RAN officers. I think there were good and bad Royal Navy officers and good and bad RAN Navy officers. But the key drivers, I think, were the poor conditions by the sailors below decks.
I agree with that, too.
And do you think, though, that in this there was a lack of ability to air their grievances as well? Like that seemed to run through.
Andrew was asking about the lack of a process to air grievances from below decks. In the Royal Navy and the RAN, there were always two systems. There was the formal system, which wasn't very good at allowing grievances to be aired. The captain was the judge and jury, and that was it. The reality was the petty officers and the chaplains were the people who actually kept tabs on the crew. They were the first point of touchstone to identify issues within the crew. And this happened on HMAS Brisbane in 1924 when there was a sailor murder. And there were rumours circulating around below decks for months about a particular sailor molesting sailors in their bunks. But it never got above the petty officers and the chaplain. And that's because they didn't have any hard evidence. So I think there's the formal system and then there's the informal system. Neither were working terribly well. After the war, they created a committee structure to air grievances, and that was in direct response to something that happened in Australia. But it broke down in the 20s, and it went into abeyance in the interval period. So it wasn't until after World War II, really, that a better system of airing grievances within the RAN occurred. So,
Have you ever wrote any stories pertaining to a bit more modern history of mutiny, particularly in the mid-60s, when the Garden Island grassland was built by every sailor on every ship that was in the dock at the time because they were seen off by the pay structure that was changed in the Navy at the time, and they all went on mutiny?
yeah, there are two famous mutinies. Sorry, I was just asked about a mutiny over pay in the RAN in Sydney in I think the 60s, you said, but there are two famous mutinies, one in the Royal Navy over pay, the Invergordon Mutiny in 1933, and the one in Sydney. The one in Sydney was handled much better by the senior officers of the Commonwealth Naval Board and the senior naval officer in Sydney. They basically went in and listened to the men's concerns and addressed them.
Was it started more by a civilian type of pay structure that upset the Navy, or was it the other way around?
Look, I think there'd been a standing grievance for a long time about poor pay scales. And they were seeing that they could get better pay outside. And so it wasn't really a mutiny, it was a strike. And there was no violence.
No.
And the same thing in the Invergordon mutiny, it wasn't really a mutiny, it was a strike, and without violence again. I think we're done, Andrew.
Vice President John Benton.
Robert, I read the Dark Secrets during the first lockdown, and I found it riveting. It's one of those books which you can't put down. It brought to life those tragic events back in 1942, and if anybody hasn't read it, I recommend they do. I feel it quite an honour to be asked to say a few words of thanks to Robert. Robert's painstaking research into this shocking murder is evident. He not only researched the murders, but he also, the effects on the families, again involved very deep research. And it must have taken a long time to go around all the families, I'm sure. The Naval Historical Society of Victoria has a strong connection to these events of the 12th of November 1942 on board HMAS Australia. I'm sure most of you remember Data Smythe. He was a very strong supporter of this chapter. At that time, he was a midshipman on board the Australia, and in fact, he came on watch at 8 o'clock in the evening, and I believe the murder was around about then, because he said that his eyes weren't used to the ship's blacked out, his eyes weren't used to the blackout. But he heard the screams, and he said it was absolutely chilling, and he said it's something he never forgot. And so there's another connection with Robert and this chapter, which he probably doesn't know. You ought to remember Hugh Jarrett, who was a president for quite some time with this chapter. Well, Hugh Jarrett was on the Brisbane in Tokyo Bay for the surrender. So there's a very good chance that Hugh and Robert's father met, well, they would have met. It's only a small ship, though, the Brisbane, sorry. So, anyway, thank you, Robert, for an outstanding presentation, which will be long remembered. Thank you.